My name's Nico. I'm the director of the Shorenstein Center here at Harvard. Welcome. Thank you for your time. This is the discussion of the Republican primaries and convention. Just a few brief announcements. First, just a reminder that everything said is embargoed until 7:30 p.m. tonight. We're trying to keep the focus on what's happening in this room until 7:30 p.m. tonight. For those of you coming to the forum event tonight with Kellyanne Conway, Robbie Mook, and Jake Tapper, tickets, it is a ticketed event. Tickets will be passed out at lunch at the conclusion of this session. I wanted participants, I need your attention for 1 minute. With this many people at the table, we can only really have 2 mics on at a time. Your mic is on with the red, when the red light goes on. So if you can just help me pay attention, that turn your mic off when you're done speaking. That's really going to improve the overall quality of the audio and the event. Finally, just a reminder that this is really for history, for posterity. We publish a book. This is a primary source for most presidential biographers. It's the only time when everybody is in the room all at once. And we really hope to capture for history what happened in this historic election. I'm going to introduce our moderators today. We have Jonathan Karl of ABC News, Molly Ball of The Atlantic, and Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you, Nico. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So I want to add a couple more ground rules. There are so many people here. It would be great if you could say who you are and which campaign you're from when you speak. This is not going to be a fair or balanced panel. There are some of you we're more interested in hearing from than others, for history's sake. And we're going to try to be relatively ruthless about that, given the time limits. And we need to stay focused on the primary since there is a general election panel later today. So please try to confine your comments. Most of you didn't make it out of the primary, but please try to confine your comments to the primary. Yeah, so we are going to start with a clip of what we may not have known at the time, but in retrospect appears to have been the defining moment of this presidential election.
They're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
All right, so we are going, I'm going to direct the first question to the representatives from the Jeb Bush campaign. On the day that this happened, you were the front runners. What was going through your minds? What was your initial reaction to watching that?
I thought the statement was problematic for Donald Trump. I thought the statement was inconsistent with the autopsy that had been done by the Republican National Committee, and inconsistent with an approach that would win a general election.
Let me back up a step before that and talk about, again, to the Bush people and the Rubio people, because the backdrop of that statement was, in many ways, a race that looked much different then. One of the ways it looked different was that there was a thought that these might be the 2 dominant campaigns. But it was also always clear that there was going to be a Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio campaign that was fighting over the same state, that were fighting over the same donors, that were fighting over the same spot in the establishment lane. At the beginning, I'm wondering what the conversation was like between the 2 guys themselves, between the 2 campaigns, and why both decided to run in the first place. And by the way, what about that Mitt Romney conversation with Jeb very early on?
Well, with respect to each of those conversations, I was not in the room for either one of them. With respect to Marco Rubio, yeah, he was from Florida. So was Ben Carson. So was Mike Huckabee. So there were more than 2 candidates from Florida, and the reality is that each individual held the other in very high regard, and recognized and acknowledged their political skills. Sure, there are a finite number of donors in Florida, and both sides went after them wholeheartedly. We got some, they got some, but the reality was it wasn't just kind of Jeb and Marco. Kind of Christie, as we talked about a little bit yesterday, was in a similar space. Kasich was kind of in a similar space, and the size of the field kind of made navigating that and putting together kind of a coalition, if you will, challenging.
Terry, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I would argue the premise that there was, a primary between Jeb and us. I agree with everything Danny said, which is something I don't say often. But in addition, look, we were more interested, honestly, in Ted Cruz than we were Jeb Bush. We were never going to. We kind of thought we'd end up against more of an establishment person at the end, anyways, and we figured that would be Jeb. We did not. We figured we needed to knock out Cruz first, more so than Jeb, in the same way that everybody waited to take on Trump. So there wasn't a us for the establishment wing. I know that was a popular narrative in the media because it was easy to write, but it was inaccurate.
Well, in Todd Harris Rubio campaign, not only that wasn't just our how we saw it strategically. The data actually backed that up. If you looked, especially in Iowa, if you looked at Rubio voters and then drilled down deeper to ask, well, who's your second choice? It was Ted Cruz, far and away. It was Ted Cruz and Ben Carson were the top two second choice picks for our voters. You had to go down 7 or 8 candidates deep before any of our voters in Iowa were picking Jeb, which was one of the reasons why we were always, in addition to being really annoyed by it, we were baffled by the tens of millions of dollars that the Bush super PAC spent attacking us, because when you were peeling our vote off, they weren't going to Jeb.
So, Mike and Jeff, how did you see the race at that point? And did anybody see those guys back there, the Trump campaign, as the problem at that point?
We saw when Jeb got in the race, we felt that there was Mike DuHaime from the Christie campaign. We felt that at that moment he was the front runner for the establishment piece, and that we felt that we needed to kind of win, if you will, kind of a governor's race. That at the end of the day, our goal was to be among 3 or 4 standing at the end, and the hope to be the last governor, and potentially seeing Rubio in there, Cruz in there, and obviously we at some point felt pretty strongly on that Trump would be in there as well, and that if we could be the only kind of if we could be one of those 4, that would be a great place for us. I think, as I said yesterday, certainly when Trump made this announcement and then shot up in the polls fairly quickly, and really after that first debate, it became pretty clear to us that he was in for the long term, and that we would need to have to try to wait until we could win among that smaller group before we could get to there. Oftentimes people say, why don't you attack him when somebody's at 33% and you're at 2 or 4 or 5%? You don't have the standing to do that. So we needed to slug it out, if you will, kind of win, among the governor's group, and the hope that be the one chief executive standing there and have that message versus a few senators and a businessman, that would be a good place for us.
You're talking mainly about voters, but what about with donors? There was obviously a disconnect between voters and donors in this
Sure. I mean, I
primary
think
general.
the donor world completely changed when Jeb got in. I mean, there is no donor network close to the Bush donor network. So it completely changed. We were, from a donor point of view, second choice to a lot of Jeb voters. I'm sure a lot of other people around the table heard the exact same thing. I'd be with you, but I've been with Bush since 1979, so I'm going to be with Jeb, right? So like, that's a reality and a great advantage they had. It turned out to actually be a great disadvantage in this race. I remember feeling early on that neither Bush nor Clinton would be president, right? So that's the vibe that a lot of us got. But from a donor point of view, it it was really problematic. I was telling somebody privately yesterday, when we ran the governor's reelection campaign, we spent about $24 million. In the presidential campaign, we had about $8 million in the hard dollar side. So, I mean, it's very, very different. Once he got in, it fundamentally changed the race, I think, for everyone from the establishment side that needed to raise money, couldn't self-fund. It was, Jeb being in was a huge obstacle for everyone. And I wholeheartedly agree that anytime any one of us got any oxygen, certainly for Christie, it was after the union leader endorsement started to shoot up. As soon as any one of us got any oxygen, Jeb's super PAC hammered whoever got oxygen. So when we got oxygen, we got hammered. Rubio got it worse than anybody. And the beneficiary, I think, in many ways, was obviously the Trump campaign.
So can we get back to the announcement, though, Corey? When you heard those words about Mexico, did you know he was going to say that?
It was perfectly scripted, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Like everything with the Trump campaign, it's perfectly scripted. Look, anybody who could say that they knew what Donald Trump was going to say when he walked onto that stage would be lying to you, because I spent the weekend before that announcement writing his announcement speech, and it timed out at like 7 minutes and 45 seconds. And if the media remembers, we actually delivered the prepared remarks to the media before he actually took the stage. And I think only one outlet actually used those prepared remarks that we gave him. But, I don't think anybody... Remember, there were hundreds of media there. There was no firestorm immediately following this announcement. It was 3 days until Hillary Clinton said the rhetoric that Donald Trump is using is what is causing the problems that we have. And she blamed, if you remember, the South Carolina shooting on Donald Trump's rhetoric. And that's when the media, 3 days later, we announced on a Tuesday, it wasn't until Friday where the media storm went back and said, oh, Donald Trump said all these disparaging things about Mexicans, which happen to be true, as we know. So, what's very disingenuous, I think, is this notion that the media immediately stepped on this and saw that this was a massive mistake by the Trump campaign and jumped on it. That's not what happened. And what happens on multiple occasions with the media is, with all due respect, they see something firsthand and don't realize how big of a story it is until other media members jump on it. And let me give you another example of it. Donald Trump was in New Hampshire fielding a question from a person who asked about Barack Obama being a Muslim. And we were traveling with a national reporter that day on the airplane, and Donald Trump literally didn't answer the question. When we left, we were in Rochester, New Hampshire at a town hall with like 3,000 people. We left, the reporter flew back to New York with us, got off the plane, got in a car, found out that this was now a media storm and wanted to go back and meet with Donald Trump. He just had, an hour of Donald Trump's time flying. Same thing. The media didn't understand or didn't think this was a big deal until someone from the other side or other media brought this to their attention. So, I think if this was such an outrage, the media would have talked about this all day Wednesday, all day Thursday. They didn't do any of those things.
Speaking of early outrages, another seminal moment earlier in the campaign was Donald Trump's remark about John McCain. I guess I'll go back to you, Corey. Was that another one of these instances where it was not realized in the moment and the firestorm came after? And where do you think that came from?
No, that one was realized immediately. That one I knew. Look, I've said this, and I'll say it again. I was in Iowa when Mr. Trump made those remarks, and as soon as he was done speaking at that particular event, I said to him, hey, Mr. Trump, can I speak to you for a second in the green room? And he said, that was great, wasn't it? And I said, I'd like to talk to you for a second. I closed the door and I said, sir, I think we have a problem. And, because I'm a campaign guy, my advice was, look, probably we need to go and apologize to John McCain for making a remark. And Donald Trump said, no, I'm going to go downstairs and do a press conference. If you remember, it was a 28-minute long press conference in the basement of a building in Iowa, where he fielded a series of questions and pushed back on the notion that he was going to apologize to John McCain because he believes that the veterans haven't been served to the fullest capacity that they can be, and that the veteran scandal in Arizona is something that should have been fixed and solved. And so many people have called, particularly that day, and we flew back to New Jersey that day and went up to Bedminster and had a series of phone calls and said, what are we going to do? And Donald Trump does what Donald Trump always does, which he doubles down. And, the media outcry was fierce. And, I've told this story. I actually called my wife we got on the plane. I said, look, I think the campaign's over. I'm coming home. And it was, like 5 weeks into the campaign. because as a political guy, that's what you think. But his instincts are so different, and he is so willing to fight and be the exact opposite. And we didn't poll test things, we didn't go out and focus group things like every other campaign did. We just did it. And because it was such a small team, and because Donald Trump has such an instinct to do things, we relied on his ability to read the American people and fought through that like we did so many other things to ultimately be successful.
But Danny, I mean, we're all talking about the media response here. The other candidate response. I mean, I remember Jeb in his first round of interviews. He didn't want to talk about Trump at all. He wanted to pretend like he didn't exist. What was the thought there? I mean, he just said what he said about immigration. That was Jeb's issue. That was Rubio's issue. I mean, why not come out at that point and condemn him? You just wanted? Did you think he was going to go away, or what was the thought?
I think Mr. Trump said things over the course of the campaign that probably would have gotten any other candidate on an exit ramp with respect to like where they were. He mentioned a few examples. There are others. I mean, that speaks to kind of probably the most determinative thing in any race, which is the environment, where people were, how they felt about the whole thing. And, so with that said, from our perspective, big field, we were ahead, had a lot of money. We wanted to focus on our guy. We wanted to focus on, what he had done in Florida and what he was going to do for America. And that's where we were. And, what happened was it started a process that everybody at this table will attest to, which is everywhere you went, anywhere you went, whenever you were doing anything, however you were doing it, you were going to get asked a question about Donald Trump.
And you were not going to answer it.
Sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. We tried it every which way to Sunday. The questions kept coming, as did everybody at this table. So when you're rolling out a policy, a well thought out policy, and the question is about something a guy said 2 days earlier, when you're running a presidential campaign, that's problematic.
So let me just throw this out to everybody, because I'm curious at this stage of the campaign, early on, when it's clear, I think as Danny, you just said, that something was happening. There was a Trump phenomenon developing, but it was not something like any of us had ever quite seen before. One of the questions that all of us had was, whose voters is he attracting? And there was a sense, for example, that the Cruz people thought, well, those are really going to be our voters when Donald Trump finally collapses and goes away. But whose voters did you all think Donald Trump was attracting in that phase in which he went from nowhere to somewhere big? Where were those people coming from? Were they your voters? Were they not voters previously at all? Who were they?
This is Terry Sullivan with Marco Rubio's campaign. I think Corey and Michael hit on it yesterday. Look, they were taking from every lane. I mean, they were taking from all of us, and it wasn't. I mean, which is. There's no one else at this table that I believe can say that to the extent that they did. I mean, we didn't share an equal part of Bush supporters or Cruz supporters or any other campaign supporters in the same way that Trump did. And I was unlike yesterday, the roundtable went around and said, when did you first know he'd be a problem? I think someone said when they first saw The Apprentice 10 years ago. I didn't, because I thought it was a reality TV gimmick. I didn't even think that he would necessarily stick in the race. And so I thought, just like with a lot of previous election cycles, the person who is in first, no one maintains a lead that long as the front runner. So I assumed, somewhat wrongly, that gravity would take course, and that why would I engage in a fight with a skilled, night fighter, when we can just let him go, let someone else go attack him. We're going to run plus we didn't have much in the way of resources, but they took from every single subgroup.
This is Ed Brookover with the Carson campaign. I think Danny said something which captures the moment, the entire moment throughout this campaign, when he talked about the environment was willing to accept this. And inside the Carson campaign, we kept saying Trump didn't choose the movement chose Trump. And so this group was out there waiting for somebody to step into this space. And if nobody had, we would fight over it in a very different way. We were trying to occupy it from Dr. Carson's little bit different personality. They were out there waiting for somebody to stand up and say, I'm with you.
This is Paul Manafort. I wasn't there in the beginning when some of these comments were made, but at that time, and really through the time I was in the campaign, we didn't look at the race the way a lot of people around here talked about it yesterday, of looking at the boxes and figuring out how we build our base. Trump was speaking to America, and he was dealing with, they always tried to pigeonhole him. He's talking to white working men, or he's talking to uneducated, older people. We were talking about a message which he instinctively understood was out there in the country. He understood Main Street. This is what has not really been appreciated. He had a sense of the country that no other candidate had, and he knew what was bothering the country. And so everybody would fixate on the McCain comment, but he was talking about the veterans that were not treated right. And the media blew up the veterans, the McCain piece, but the American people heard the veterans abuse piece and the Muslim piece. He was talking about terrorists coming into the country and not being vetted, and people being afraid to walk down the streets. The media heard Muslim. And you can go through almost any one of the faux pas, so to speak, and you'll see that the underlying message he was talking about was resonating because it's what people felt. And in putting the campaign strategy together, what Corey was doing in the beginning, what I was doing after, and what Trump was doing always, was not pigeonholing his message to a segment, not trying to do a building block approach, but to have a campaign that was speaking to the country. He knew he was not popular on the East Coast and the West Coast. He thought he could win New York, but that was because he felt there were working class people in New York State who were getting his message, which they were. And so when we try and create the boxes and the strategies, and we look at what we think are the faux pas, you got to also look at the underlying things he was saying, and it was carried right into the general election. And so we always felt comfortable that when people were criticizing him for being so outspoken, that the American voters were hearing him too.
I'd like to add to that just briefly. So, and Corey touched on this yesterday, but the centrality of the importance of the Trump rallies themselves were also important, I think, to what Paul referred to in the messaging and who Mr. Trump was appealing to, because those were open to the public. Anybody could come. Everybody did. And that was one way, he did have in that way a focus group and tested his message with those people. And those were people from all walks of life, from all over the country. And he would say things that they would react to, and he would continue to say them if they were effective. So I think that not only did he know what he wanted to say, he would say them to these large groups of people, both in the arenas and on television. Corey and I saw this over a couple of hundred Trump rallies in the primary campaign. I think it was also in a very effective way that he honed his messaging and understood, what the people in the country were thinking and wanting.
Tony Fabrizio. I think one of the problems is everybody, or many people, tried to look at the Donald Trump phenomenon through the ideological lenses which had defined previous Republican presidential nominations. And Donald Trump is post-ideological. His movement transcends ideology in a lot of respects. And a number of reporters said, well, how is the Trump Democrat the same as a Reagan Democrat? And the fact of the matter is that actually Donald Trump, through his own antenna, and trust me, many times had this conversation through his own antenna, understood the fold in American politics. It's the reason why so many Trump supporters and so many Sanders supporters agreed on so many things. And when he touched those populist buttons, so many people understood. The other thing I think is important is many of us around the table, and I started this journey with Rand Paul, with Chip, and ended up with Donald Trump, we think we misunderstood the anger. We really misunderstood, particularly the anger in the Republican Party, how they felt about Washington and how they felt about politicians. And one of the things that we saw consistently in our research, and you could even see it in the public research if you bothered to just look, is voters overwhelmingly preferred to have somebody who spoke their mind, even though it wasn't politically correct, rather than somebody who would kind of polish what they wanted to say to be politically correct. And every time Donald Trump said something, as Corey pointed out or as Mike pointed out, and he went downstairs and doubled down, that only proved to those voters that he would speak his mind and not lie to them. And it's what they wanted. Couple that with the anger. His best group of voters were voters who said they were angry. And let me tell you, in the Republican primary, a third of voters would tell you they were outright angry, with another 60% telling you they're dissatisfied. Less than 10% of Republican primary voters said they were happy or pleased with the federal government. So it was a rich pool to tap into, and he had his own voice that tapped into them.
Can we hear from some of the Cruz people? Because you and your candidate obviously did have a highly ideological model of the Republican primary electorate. In retrospect, how do you respond to what Tony's saying?
Jason Johnson, Cruz campaign. I agree with what Tony just said, and I think it's well said, post-ideological. In a campaign, it clearly, for this particular year, was perfect. It was unstoppable. The anger, as Tony referenced, that existed among Republican primary voters, as you know, also extended well beyond people with a history of voting in the Republican primary. And this is something I think a lot of people have understood for many years. You know, from our perspective as a campaign with a candidate who, yes, it wasn't just a strategy, someone who is a, as he says, a self-described constitutional conservative, a federalist, that without question limited, and no problem with this, by the way, limited what our options were in tapping into some of the emotions and feelings that were just described. Because, you take any of the issues, and I agree also with the way it was described about the double down and how the media would focus on Muslim, but the people were thinking about terrorism, et cetera. We had a candidate, take that example, who frankly was not willing to say, not because he was worried about whether or not it was politically correct, but because in his view, to have a blanket ban, on a group of people based on their religion, that was a bit of a constitutional challenge. And so he just wasn't willing to say that. But he understood where Donald Trump was coming from, and he certainly understood the attraction and the appeal to the voters.
Okay, I want to get to another big moment, which was the first debate. You remember that one, Corey? So that obviously touched off what, at least in public, seemed to be a war between Trump and Fox News, which was interesting because he found himself at war with the Koch brothers and with Fox News, all what you thought were the power centers in a Republican primary. How real was that war, and what were the back channel conversations that were going on between Roger Ailes and others at Fox and the campaign, while he essentially, for a while, was at war not just with Megyn Kelly but with the network?
I don't want to provide details on private conversations that Mr. Trump has had with Roger Ailes or other network executives, because that's not my place to do that. But what I can tell you is that there was clearly he felt, in my words, that he was set up, that it was a question that was designed. If you remember how that first debate began, right? What was the first question from Brett Baer? Everyone remember it?
Yep.
Right? Raise your hand. This was a gotcha question. It was a gotcha. And Donald Trump was the only person who had the tenacity to actually raise his hand, when now we see that others actually didn't and weren't honest, and they should have raised their hand, because as you follow through, they didn't endorse Donald Trump when he became the Republican nominee. But that takes courage. And then, a direct assault on, at the time, then and continuing to move forward for the rest of the campaign, the leading Republican candidate in the field for the White House, when the American people are tuning in to hear about issues, to make a personal attack on what Donald Trump has said, I think he took it very personally. And was that a defining moment with the relationship with Fox? I think it clearly had a factor in it. But I also think you have to remember there were executives at Fox whose family members were working for other campaigns. And, that was never disclosed either. And I think many of us thought people who had direct access to writing questions that were going to be on that debate had their own motivation for taking Donald Trump down. And they thought that that's what that first and second question were going to do during that debate. And look, Donald Trump has been a person, and Jeff Zucker will tell you because he's seen this, that if he sees a strike, he calls it a strike. If it's a ball, he calls it a ball.
Wait, I'm sorry, are you suggesting that other candidates had questions?
No, what I'm suggesting is that there are executives in the Fox News network whose family members were working for other campaigns, and Donald Trump was aware of that and didn't know if that had some factor in the decisions of the questions that were asked. So, I think Donald Trump is a person who has granted more media access than any candidate in the history of a presidential campaign. He did, I think, 140 interviews with people from the failing New York Times, between the primary and the general election. It's amazing. So, Donald Trump is a person who is willing to answer any question, and I think you have seen that from his interviews. But he's also going to push back if he thinks the questions are unfair. And I think what that particular question did that was asked from Megyn Kelly was reminded the American people that Donald Trump is going to say things that other politicians won't say because he's not accountable to them.
But what were the conversations? Because the campaigns all around this table, except for yours, were doing everything they can to be on Fox as much as possible. That was the way to reach out to the Republican primary. And here you were in an open war with Fox. Did you go up? Did you talk to Trump and say maybe we should step down? What were the conversations about?
No, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that because, look, Donald Trump understands the media, and he understands the American electorate, and he understands how to drive a message. And look, I think Fox has a significant role in the Republican primary voting people. However, Donald Trump also has the ability to bypass the mainstream media by going directly to social media and using it more effectively than anybody has. Not just his Twitter account, his Facebook account, his Instagram account, which now I think between those three mediums have 30 million people. That's just one opportunity. He also understands that he can hold a press conference, or he can go on a different network, or he can phone into a station and get the same coverage and not have to be on Fox. And look, the primary electorate that Donald Trump was courting was not necessarily all Fox viewers. We know that, right? There is a significant portion that watch Fox every day, but there's just as many people that watch Morning Joe, and just as many people that watch CNN, and just as many people who watch ABC, NBC, and CBS. And if you think of what Donald Trump did, he did the Sunday shows on a very regular basis. He was very available to the media to sit down, and he could get his message out through the social media channels and didn't necessarily, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, need Fox News to be successful. He could engage in a war for a limited period of time, hold his ground, and still be successful.
This is Mike DuHaime from the Christie campaign. Trump team may have been at war with Fox News. Fox News was not at war with Trump campaign. This was so mutually beneficial. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. They played it well. The way Fox News goes to war with someone is to ignore them. They were, to this point, the biggest platform. And to say that they were at war with Trump campaign is like a joke.
So it wasn't real? You think this was all?
I think from the Fox News perspective, Donald Trump is good for ratings. Tony said something before about how, looking at the electorate in a different way. When I heard everybody talk about the rationale yesterday, the big issue was ultimately we all sounded the same, except for Trump. He was willing to say and do things differently. He wasn't beholden to any record. We would argue, Christie had more jobs than Jeb Bush had in Florida, and Scott Walker had more, and he was fifth in the Midwest, not sixth in the Midwest. And and Marco Rubio voted for this, and Ted Cruz voted for that. It all sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher, right? Nobody's paying attention, and he sounded different. So if you're Fox or you're CNN, you want Donald Trump on because he's creating eyeballs, and we weren't. And that's ultimately what it was at the end of the day. But to say Fox News was at war with Trump is completely inaccurate.
But through that period, one of the things that Donald Trump was doing was saying some pretty vicious things about the other candidates whose representatives sit around this table. And there was a sense that there was a reluctance to go back at him. And was that because people thought the flawed messenger would eventually collapse and nobody wanted to offend his followers because they could be yours at some point? Or was it nobody gets into a fight with Donald Trump, a knife fight with Donald Trump, and comes out looking good? Or both of those things? Why not engage him more early on, either directly on a debate stage or through the media?
This is Chip Englander with Rand Paul's campaign. I mean, Rand was, I think, the first one out of the gate to attack Trump at that first debate. I mean, on that question, raise your hand, when he didn't raise his hand, Rand went right after him and was very sort of hands-on and aggressive throughout that debate, and his reward was sinking poll numbers. I mean, they were already had gone low. Trump had already sort of taken all our voters, and then after that debate, they got worse.
Although Carly Fiorina got stuck in the kids' table debate and broke through largely by attacking Trump.
Yep.
I would say Chip brings up a good point. The first debate as a Christie campaign, we kind of felt that they were going to pit Christie against Rand Paul at one point. They obviously had a history of going back and forth at each other. They had very different positions on national security issues, to say the least, and we felt that was going to be a set-up question, and we were prepared for it, and it happened. What happened was we thought we got the best of the exchange. Maybe the Rand Paul team thought they got the best of the exchange, but the voters didn't like either one of them because the dynamic in Republican primaries, most of the voters kind of liked all the candidates. They were eventually going to pick one, and so we saw by beating each other up, while in the green room we might be high-fiving because our guy landed a punch, the voters really didn't like either one of them beating each other up. So early on in the campaign, you have to wait and pick your spots, and obviously we obviously had to change our tactics at the very end for us. But I think what we found was certainly Trump was more than capable of handling himself, as Jeb Bush and others found out. But also, our voters kind of liked a lot of candidates. And the more you got into a back and forth with anybody, the more they didn't like you beating up someone else they liked.
This is Jeff with the Cruz campaign. One thing I'd add is that at the beginning of a campaign, it's like a golf tournament. Everybody's working on their own game. You don't spend a lot of time. I mean, we'd hear that Carson was doing something or talking to a state senator, or Walker was working somebody that we were trying to get. But you're just working, you're playing against yourself. And that's really when the dynamics of a campaign really start out, where people set their candidacy, the narrative for their candidacy. And if they can't have their own game strong enough to eventually withstand a challenge from another candidate, as the golf match turns into a tennis match and ends up in a curb-stomping gang war, that's when you really have to have your own narrative and moored to your narrative. And so at the beginning of the campaign, when the question is, why didn't you take on Donald Trump? The question really, why would you? And it's not necessarily, from our perspective, to Chip's point, that was actually a little bit later in the game, but I mean, some people would have a rationale to do so. I mean, Lindsey Graham had a rationale to do so. If you want to be the anti-Donald Trump, Bobby Jindal had one. He was a thoughtful governor from a southern state. Like, there are some narratives where you want to be that person to take them on. But for our standpoint, we just need to get our own ship in order. We need to raise money. We need to get organized. We need to be not an Iowa-only bust candidate. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we had to get done before we could even worry about taking on anybody, besides dropping Oppo on Marco or Carson or something here and there. Like, you're just working on your own game.
Well, I want to briefly hit on the Muslim ban and a specific question to Corey, because you were there at the time. Where did that come from? I mean, Trump comes out and he reads the statement off a piece, including his middle initial, Donald J. Trump. Who wrote that? What was the thinking at that moment? And how much in advance did he went out there? I mean,
don't forget that was December 7th.
Yeah.
Pearl Harbor Day, and that was delivered in South Carolina on a battleship. And I know that, the media wants to focus on what the statement said, but if you remember, the visuals.
Imagine that. We're going to talk about what the statement said.
The visuals and the timing are, we're not done by happenstance. We didn't just decide on December 6th that this would be something we could do cool tomorrow in South Carolina on a battleship. I think a lot of times the media would read into things or didn't look at how much planning actually went into what Donald Trump was doing. And, we didn't go and focus group this. But what we did do is, for many days prior to this statement being released, we had an internal conversation. And that conversation started on the airplane with Michael and some of our other staff. And we started calling people and said, what do you think of this idea? And to a person at the time, based on the recent terrorist activity which had taken place in the country, and we're going to be tough on terrorism, what do you think? Is this something we should do? This was one of the things in the campaign that actually took multiple days to vet internally, which is very rare for a campaign of our size, which was a 5-person decision matrix, right? We actually called a lot of people, and this is something where Donald Trump spent a lot of time thinking about doing this before we wrote this statement and actually going forward with it.
I want to follow up on what Corey said. There's on the, I guess, whatever we call them, snafus, faux pas, misstatements. I don't think that, I certainly don't think the Republican primary electorate was as nearly as offended by any of these statements, from John McCain to ban on Muslims to anything, as the media. And beyond that, the fact that the media was so up in arms about it made it, even if you were given a choice as a Republican primary voter, should I side with Donald Trump, who said something I may not fully agree with, or the media who's just kicking the crap out of him for saying it?
But it wasn't just the media. I mean, I draw Rick in here. Scott Walker during this period dropped out and basically dropped out with a statement that said essentially, we owe it to ourselves to all get together and stop Donald Trump. So it wasn't just us.
Fair, but it was the elite. I hate to use that word, but it was this kind of elite attitude. It wasn't middle America who were like,
Scott Walker the elite? Come on.
Well, but I do want to hear Rick talk a little bit about how that statement came about and what the reverberations of it were.
Well, I think, and even going back to, I think, Jonathan's point of, what Scott Walker was attacked by Donald Trump about his perceived failed record in Wisconsin, which was not true. I mean, Scott Walker completely reformed Wisconsin, but and the governor had a very good response. These are the worn out talking points of the Democrats and things like that. What happened though, and any candidate that was attacked by Donald Trump, when CNN puts up Donald Trump's tweet and they keep it there for hours and they panel after panel after panel talks about what Donald Trump said about your candidate. I mean, there's absolutely no way to get off the mat. So that's why the majority of us, and I think Dan said this, you have to run your own race and you have to keep about where you are. I think also a lot of people didn't understand, and around the time the governor dropped out, was you still weren't sure. There were so many things that were happening, but you were still convinced, I believe, that the public would come around and we all thought this would be an issue-based campaign, right? I mean, we rolled out an Obamacare repeal and replace plan that was very well received. It got maybe 12 hours of oxygen. I mean, there was just nothing there in this campaign. And I think, from the governor's perspective and others, it was 8 years of a failed, first-term United States senator. They were ready for executive leadership, and the governor was thinking that same thing. And at the end of the day, everyone, except the Trump team, misread what the public was doing and thinking out there.
I want to add to what Rick said, because I don't think that you can underestimate the importance of the fact that, from the start of this race, it wasn't like it was Trump versus Michelle Bachmann and Tom Tancredo. The size of the field and the strength of the field was such that it created an environment. I remember talking to reporters early on, and I compared it to that this was a pie, and the problem for all of us was that this pie was divided up into 16 pieces, and one of those pieces is made out of titanium. And no matter what you do, you will never be able to cut into that one piece. But once all of these other pieces start to come together, you would end up with, if not a plurality, a majority. And so whether it was, should we condemn what Trump said on Tuesday, or how should we go about engaging him? Everything was done through this multi-dimensional chess viewpoint of, okay, we know where we are now in September, October, but eventually we want to be in a situation where the field isn't quite as bifurcated and we have more of a clean shot.
And that piece was a third of the pie.
A third, exactly.
A third of the pies. And 16 other people were arm wrestling for the 66% that remained. You look at that statement, I guess I'm thinking to myself, who else could have issued that statement around this table? I know
Well, we actually did in early November.
I know my candidate could not have, and he looked at this issue, which is really the Syria issue, right? And how to create a safe zone, how to keep the refugees there, because this is largely a question about refugees and how to deal with it from a national security perspective. We had other candidates that were in the Senate that dealt with these issues, and this was just not a viable route for a candidate such as mine to pursue. Clearly, it worked for the Trump campaign, and they deserve credit for that, but you have to look at your individual, that person's narrative, and the authenticity and truth to the narrative of the individual that you are working for. There are certain things you can pull off and certain things you cannot. And from my perspective, that was not something that my campaign would have been able to pull off.
I mean, Ben called for a temporary ban on Muslim music on this week. Had to be the first.
That's ABC's this week, right?
Yeah, exactly. The first couple weekends in November. I remember we were at a finance retreat at Sea Island.
Right.
And there was a college football game, so it was in November. And, I remember at the time I was standing, just off set with him, and I thought, oof. I said that a lot. But because at that point we had, more Facebook followers than anybody, and, 4 or 5 million people, and the feedback was amazing. And then we did eventually test it, and some public polls tested it, and it was like a 70-30 issue in the Republican primary. So, it was one of those things which was a huge media controversy, but to Republican primary voters, it wasn't a controversy at all. We raised money because he said it. We didn't use it, but I mean, it was a very popular thing. But I think we came at it very, very differently. I mean, Ben's lane was the nice, decent, smart outsider who occasionally said really dumb things. Usually only on national television. But I mean, we understood that when the governors were talking about how many jobs they created in their state, they were shooting themselves in the foot. They were not being able to grow their coalitions because they were talking about how good I am at being a politician. And the electorate in all lanes, and I don't care if you're an economic or social, where it is you fit in the spectrum, there are people that were angry. There are people who had given up hope on the Republican Party. There are certainly people who had given up hope on Washington. And saying that, here's what I'd done, or here's my record, or here's my policy plan was not very helpful.
We should probably move on to Iowa pretty quickly, but there are two loose threads I wanted to grab here just before we do that maybe show what a change year this really was. I mean, I think Mike Huckabee had a populist message that not that different from Donald Trump's, but he wasn't the guy who took off. Was that because there wasn't the anger associated with it, A? And B, there used to be a national security bloc, particularly in South Carolina, in the Republican primary electorate, which you guys tried in the Graham campaign to grab a hold of, and they just didn't seem to be there this year. So have they disappeared? That's my second question, but first for you.
I mean, absolutely. We had been, in large part, talking about the, forgotten man, Main Street, Washington to Wall Street axis of power for a decade. And it played really well for us in 2008 and was one of the reasons we won Iowa and went on to win several other southern states was that economic populist message. This cycle, we were never able to break through. One, we weren't the new fresh face and no one wanted to talk about anything. We would say almost an identical statement days before and no one picked it up, and Trump would come in and it would be wall-to-wall coverage for the next week. And so you just couldn't compete with that. I think one of the other things, and a couple of these guys mentioned it, I know Mike did, we thought as a successful governor, he'd been governor for 10.5 years, major reform, talking about being able to be an outside of Washington reformer was going to be a good selling point. I know Scott Walker kind of saw that same thread, that we can campaign against Washington but actually have pragmatic solutions. What we missed was nobody cared about solutions. They just wanted to burn it all down. They didn't care about building it back up. They wanted to burn it to the ground, and we'd figure out what to do with the ashes afterwards. There was no, understanding of this electorate and the anger on the front end of just how pissed off they were. And they really didn't care about, you may have the best policy in the world to give every single American the best job they've ever had. Nobody cared. They simply wanted to just burn things to the ground and figure out how to pick up the pieces later. And that was something we all missed.
It's not by accident that the final three, I mean, if you take the Kasich campaign out of it, which I think you should, first, second, and third place in reverse order had the least amount of perceived government experience of the entire 16 in the field, and we never talked about it. We got commercial after commercial about how little experience or how many missed votes in the Senate. It didn't matter. People don't care. I mean, the Senate sucks. Why would we want to be there? We're not voting. Who cares? And voters bought into that. And so, I completely agree with what Sarah's saying, and experience was a liability. It was not an asset. And we figured that out early, but Trump took it to the next level.
And where did the security voters go in the Republican electorate?
We didn't do a lot of polling in the Graham campaign because we had no money and no exposure, but
we did give everyone your cell phone number, though.
Everybody has a cell phone number, so that thank you for that. Look, we did do a poll early on in the exploratory phase, and what it showed was that national security and foreign policy was the top issue of concern for Republican primary voters. We felt that was a good rationale for Lindsey Graham's voice in the contest. But like everyone has said, Donald Trump took a slice from every piece of the pie, whichever way you want to describe the pie. So it wasn't like national security voters weren't there, but Donald Trump was able to get a big chunk of those. Marco Rubio was able to get a big chunk of those. I think that national security is what ultimately hurt the Carson campaign, and his lack of experience on that issue. So to say that those voters weren't there, I think is incorrect. It was there. It was there the whole time. The issue was important. The issue played a big role in the campaign, but Donald Trump was able to galvanize a lot of that support behind him.
I think that the number one thing, because we went up to Iowa for 3 or 4 days before this all got started and did a bunch of focus groups, trying to figure out what people wanted, what's the baseline, and because I thought Ben's lack of government experience was going to be a negative. Well, it wasn't, right? But what they wanted more than anything else was strength. And Donald Trump was supplying it every day.
So I want to go to another key moment jumping forward. I'm going to actually bypass Iowa and go right to New Hampshire. I think you may remember this, Todd. We should have a clip of the debate in New Hampshire before the primary. Do we have that? It's better without the sound.
Rewind.
Barack Obama. And let's dispel once and for all with this fiction that Barack Obama doesn't know what he's doing. He knows exactly what he's doing. Barack Obama is undertaking a systematic effort to change this country.
You talk about Hezbollah Sanctions Act that you list as one of your accomplishments and just did. You weren't even there to vote for it. That's not leadership, that's truancy.
Let's dispel with this fiction that Barack Obama doesn't know what he's doing. He knows exactly what he's doing. He is trying to change this country. He wants America to become more like the rest of the world.
Washington, D.C. does. The drive-by shot at the beginning with incorrect and incomplete information, and then the memorized 25-second speech that is exactly what his advisors gave.
So, yeah, we get the idea. We kind of should cut that down. Mike, let's begin with you on this. Did you, what was the conversation going into that debate? Did you intend, or did Christie simply see an opening there? Was there any discussion of doing something similar with Trump if there had been an opening?
So yes, we obviously had stoked that all week. We spent the entire week saying we were going to do it, right? They knew it. They knew we were coming. We knew it. The press knew it. We needed, after Iowa and after our poor placement in Iowa, we needed to stay in the conversation. And quite frankly, our plan all along was to do that with Marco Rubio at some point. Every time we did debate prep, we felt that he telegraphed himself in the debates. And in an 11-person debate, he sounds awesome when he has 60 seconds and then there's 10 minutes in between and then he goes back. And we felt at some point, if we could get into a one-on-one with Marco Rubio, that's what would happen. We hoped that it would be much later. Obviously, we didn't know it would happen, but we felt it could happen. We could set ourselves up for that to happen. We wanted to do that much later in the campaign, obviously, when there were 3 or 4 people on the stage, but we felt this was our last gasp at oxygen for that campaign. So we did it at that time to stay relevant and stay in. And, what we found was certainly we peeled voters off of Marco Rubio, but they didn't come to us. They went to either Kasich or Trump. They went to other people, and that's the dynamic. When you talk about why didn't people take on Trump earlier, anybody earlier, that's a dynamic we were all looking for. When you do that, you hope they're going to come to you, but they have other choices as well. So we certainly planned it. We were ready. We did exactly as we wanted. Quite frankly, I think Senator Rubio played into it more than we could have ever anticipated, and Governor Christie's good enough that in the moment he could even go even further on it. But it certainly was something that we planned. It was certainly something that we saw months in advance that could happen. It did happen as we wanted it to, but ultimately the voters chose neither one of them, which is what happens in a multi-candidate field.
Todd, Terry.
I think the context is important. We had come out of Iowa with, to our shock and surprise, with all the momentum that we had assumed that Cruz was going to get. We somehow were able to grab a big chunk of that, and we were in the ascendancy in New Hampshire, and ultimately, what happened was, I think, us as Marco's team, I think we failed him in that he was given very strong, conflicting advice heading into that debate. One was, the Christie campaign has been telegraphing all week, they're coming at you, so let's prep for what that moment will look like, which we did. We didn't prep for a murder-suicide moment, but we did prep for an exchange between the two of them. But at the same time, in the view of the team, it was also really important because we felt Marco was going up and Governor Christie was heading down. It was very important not to pick unnecessary fights. And
in our view, with a guy that was out, he had 3 days left in his campaign. Why would we get in a fight with a guy who's almost out? We gave bad advice that it's don't engage no matter what he does. Stay on message. Don't engage.
The problem with it, what we had not anticipated, it's very easy to say don't engage, and there are all kinds of ways that you can do that and work your way through a moment like that in the debate. What we had not anticipated was that he would just continue to say the same thing, and Marco, after the fact has said that has said as much. But ultimately, I think everyone generally agrees that Marco is a pretty gifted debater. And so, the irony of having a moment like that come during our campaign in a debate does not escape us. But having said that, this is when you gotta pin on the team and not the candidate.
Does anybody else want to talk about advice they regret giving their candidate? There's this narrative, I think, from the Trump team of he was the best candidate, he had the best instincts, this was all sort of inevitable. But do any of the other campaigns think that you made strategic mistakes in either a micro piece of advice way or in like the macro theory of the case?
Could the Kasich campaign weigh in?
If I can just throw in on that, I understand that there had been some discussion on the Jeb team about directly engaging Trump, maybe even in an appearance with O'Reilly on the issue of immigration. Was there a discussion of it would have been a much riskier strategy? We're still, but of going in and directly engaging?
I think these guys will attest that when you're kind of in the bullpen, there are a lot of ideas that come up.
Yeah.
Most of them rest on the cutting room floor, right? Some of them are taken up. From our perspective, the Trump campaign engaged Jeb pretty early. And as I stated, and I think Jeff stated, our focus was we wanted to tell our story. Guy hadn't been out there for a while, right?
No,
and we wanted to get out there and tell our story.
So in hindsight, was that a mistake? I mean, obviously that was the thinking, but now looking at what happened, I mean, could you have gone out?
I would not have changed the decision that we made.
Okay.
Look, you know what I think? I think Marco tried to engage after one of the debates and get very aggressive for about a 72 to 96 hour window. And the reason I think a lot of people wouldn't engage with Trump is, number one, he's a master brander. And little Marco or Lion Ted or low energy Jeb, you have a massive platform to pin a name on somebody that happens to stick. But more importantly, Donald Trump isn't and wasn't beholden to the donors. And from what I understand, Marco was very aggressive for a 3 or 4 day window, attacking Donald Trump, going after his hands, which I think Donald Trump then talked about on the debate stage. And he's not reliant to go back to the donors and the donors to say, you can't do this. I don't want that, right? Donald Trump was free from that encumbrance to have to go back to a major donor or to raise money for a super PAC and say, should I do this or shouldn't I do that? And we all know when you're raising money, donors have a way that they want to influence the campaign. They want to talk to the candidate. They want to tell him what he should or shouldn't say. We were free of that. And so I don't want to speak for the Rubio campaign because it's not the right thing to do, but I think we did see them engage Donald Trump very head on coming out of one of the debates. And we saw Marco go out and start attacking Donald Trump directly. And I think it's the only time in the campaign that there was a direct assault on Mr. Trump, because I think many of the other campaigns, whether it was the Kasich campaign or others, they'd make commercials with 3 or 4 or 5 candidates in it. And so this is bad about Bush, and this is bad about Christie, and this is bad about Trump, and it was just not effective.
We, heading into that debate, the thinking with in our campaign.
Which debate are you talking about? Are you still
what Corey's talking about, where we
Texas?
where we engaged for the first time. It actually had less to do with Trump than it did with Cruz. What we wanted to show was because Cruz had been going after Trump for a while and wasn't getting the traction maybe that they had hoped. And what we wanted to show was give us the chance. Let us go one-on-one. It goes back to what we were talking about the pie before. Like, give us a clean shot at Trump. And we felt like the only way to do that was to aggressively go after Trump and show what Marco was capable of doing. And for a couple of days, it was working. I mean, all of a sudden, our rallies were being taken live on CNN, which is something that had never happened before. And it was happening because we were talking about Trump. So they would take like the first 10 minutes live when Marco would talk about Trump, and then when he would switch, not even 10, 5 minutes, and then when he would switch to his message, they'd cut away. But that was our attempt at kind of boxing out the Cruz campaign and getting a clean shot at Trump.
Let's relive a couple of those moments, if you don't mind. We'll start with Rubio, and then we'll turn to Cruz. But I think we have that Texas debate and the immediate aftermath.
He's always calling me Little Marco. And I'll admit, the guy, he's taller than me, he's like 6'2", which is why I don't understand why his hands are the size of someone who's 5'2". Have you seen his hands? They're like this. And you know what they say about men with small hands? You can't trust
those hands. Are they small hands? And you referred to my hands. If they're small, something else must be small. I guarantee you there's no problem. I guarantee.
Okay, so that that was Senator Rubio's effort to be the one to go ahead. Not long later, we had Ted Cruz.
Donald Trump alleges that my dad was involved in assassinating JFK. Now, let's be clear. This is nuts. This is not a reasonable position. This is just kooky. All across the country, I'm going to tell you what I really think of Donald Trump. This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth.
That went on a little longer too, as you remember, Jeff. So we heard a little bit from Todd about what the thinking was about going after Trump when he did. What was thinking here? Of course, he did it earlier in the debate where he talked about New York values, et cetera. What was the thinking there?
Not sure there was much thinking at that point.
Yeah.
No, I mean, you find yourself in a position in a Republican primary for President of the United States where the front cover of the National Enquirer is more influential at a point in time than, pick your source. From alleged affairs to your father, I mean, pardon the expression, but you can't make this shit up. Assassinating JFK. And so at some point, you have to deal with it. And I think what you saw there, I mean, Danny made a great point earlier about the statement on December the 7th. Jeb Bush could never put out that statement. Ted Cruz could never put out that statement. And I think the contrast you just saw as well with Ted Cruz dealing with his father allegedly shooting John F. Kennedy and Senator Rubio dealing with small hands was a great contrast in their natural way of dealing with things. One maybe leans a little towards nuance and scholarly and lawyerly, and one frankly was pretty dang entertaining. But we had to deal with it, and that's the way he did it.
Corey, did Trump believe the Rafael Cruz Kennedy assassination tie?
I don't think he said he shot JFK, to be clear. I don't think he said that. I think, what he said was this is what's on the cover of a, news outlet. And, the media decided to run with that. And I think Donald Trump was just pointing out the obvious of, the cover of the Inquirer that week. And, again, I think the media gets so hyped up. There is
Corey. He quoted the
thing.
National Enquirer.
It's a Pulitzer Prize winning publication, I think.
Yeah, but
Right,
you guys ran with it. Wait,
this
back
is the
up
problem.
Corey here.
No, this is exactly right. See, this is the problem with the media. You guys took everything Donald Trump said so literally. And the problem with that is the American people didn't. And they understood it. They understood that sometimes when you have a conversation with people, whether it's around the dinner table or it's at the bar or it's wherever it is, you're going to say something and maybe you don't have all the facts to back that up. But that's how the American people live. And look, I see it every day in the mainstream publications, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, or the New York Times. There are pathological liars writing for those papers every day. And that's the facts, but you have a bigger microphone. And what you guys don't like from the media is that someone actually held you accountable for it. That's what it comes down to. And you guys want to go and say, Donald Trump said this, Donald Trump said that. Yeah, guess what? If I had the opportunity to go through and pick out every story in the Washington Post, which I know to be factually inaccurate, I could be here all day long. That's the difference. And Donald Trump had a big microphone. You guys gave him part of that microphone because you wanted the opportunity to not make him a real candidate. I heard it from day one. He will never file his personal financial disclosure statement because he's not very rich. We didn't ask for an extension. We filed it in 29 days. Donald Trump, once he loses in a state, will get out of the race because he can't stand losing. Well, he lost Iowa, came in second, and then went on to win 38 more times. Every narrative that the media had was wrong about Donald Trump. And that's the difference.
Just 1 second. I want to make a point. How many people in this room use Twitter daily? Raise your hand. Come on, everybody raise their hand. You know every single one of you do. Do you know only 20% of voters use Twitter daily? I'll let Brad talk more to the social media. Huh? No, it's actually, of the people who voted in the post-elect, it was 20% this election. So when Donald Trump tweeted something, how did the other 80% find out? Exactly. You all took that tweet, like they were talking about before, put it up on the screen for days on end, and you disseminated it. The truth of the matter is that is truly one of his greatest gifts, is understanding how to use a little fulcrum to get a lot of return. And that is exactly what he did time and time again.
I want to just add to that. This is a cycle I, noticed very early on, is that what he had the ability to do was the media would have him on. It would generate ratings for them. It would disseminate his message. They would make money. And they would have him on again, which would disseminate his message. So there was a circular process that had never happened before with any candidate in history. And that led to what Tony's talking about, what Corey's talking about. The dissemination of his message was free, and they were making money off it. So how could you resist?
I think I'm going to jump in here, Dave Kochel with Jeb. We're talking about market share, and we've studied this at Harvard all semester. Market share didn't, in fact, Donald Trump was the market. Like Zucker last night when he said, we offered all you guys an opportunity to come on air every morning. To talk about Donald Trump. I remember in New Hampshire, Dana Bash running over from a Trump event, I think now that I know we can cuss, I turned the mic on. Maybe Trump had called Jeb an asshole, and he made her say it in the interview, knowing that it was coming, but she had to stand there and try to ask it 3 times without using the word. I mean, at a certain point, he was the entire market. We were all living in his world, responding to everything. The statement on Muslim ban, Jeb was the chairman of the Constitution Center. It was a post-constitutional statement. You could never, none of us could have said that. And I have empathy for the Hillary people earlier because we're playing by a different set of rules. There was no gravity under him pulling him down when he would say and do things like this, and the rest of us, anything we would have said or done like this would have been disqualifying immediately for everybody.
But Dave, does that mean that the millions of dollars didn't matter? That or did Right to Rise not use them correctly, or was it just not going to matter this cycle?
It didn't matter. I mean, that's the theme of the whole primary. Nothing mattered. We could have. You can stack up the 1,200 years of political experience here and reporting experience in this room, and none of us could have figured out a way. Once he got to the point in the campaign in probably September, October, when everything was revolving around, his debate performance, his tweet, his outrage of the day, whatever it was, the voters at that point, I think Mike makes an excellent point here. They were punishing, they were rewarding Trump for fighting with Fox. They were rewarding Trump for fighting with CNN, with New York Times. All those guys were getting ratings. Zucker won, Trump won. Everybody was it was a circular sort of stimulus to all of that. And the rest of us were just kind of foils for it all.
But wait, the $100 million from Right to Rise, I mean, a lot of it hit Marco Rubio and then later some of the others. Could that have been more effectively used? You guys want to do a little critique?
I'll answer that, yes.
Okay.
Terry from the Marco Rubio campaign.
Yes.
I mean, if we go back and rewrite it, you'd spend it all on Donald Trump in August. But, we all thought he was going to be out. You all thought he was going to be out. Maybe he thought he was going to be out at a certain point.
Let's call the entire budget $150 million. Okay? $35 million rested with us, with me. About $120 million rested with another individual. I did not run the super PAC. I was unable to communicate with them throughout the course of the campaign. So I'm not going to address their strategy nor their actions. I can
go
address
ahead.
my strategy and my actions.
But there's one other, and Tony, I think this gets a little bit to something you mentioned. Of the many things many of us got wrong was the Trump appeal among evangelicals, and particularly that came to the fore in South Carolina. Safe to say he was not a traditional evangelical kind of candidate. How did that happen?
Several things. One is again, I go back to, and since we're allowed to curse, everybody in this room needs to pull their head out of their asses. We really live in a world where everybody thinks that ideology is linear, and that if you answer these 10 questions correctly, that makes you a conservative. Not every conservative is pro-life. Not every conservative is anti-gay marriage. Not every conservative puts 100% emphasis on this or that. And don't forget, he projected. Voters make decisions based on, I don't want to say complicated, but based on what is most important to them, overriding things. And so if you're an evangelical and your choice is Hillary Clinton to be president of the United States or Donald Trump, who do you think you're going with? Of course, he may not be perfect to you, but he is infinitely better than Hillary Clinton is going to be. And I think one of the things that they did very, very smartly and strategically, two things. One is that putting out the list of potential Supreme Court justices was, I think, a masterstroke. And two, having Mr. Trump reaffirm his commitment to being anti-abortion, Roe versus Wade. Those two things, I think, held enough with the evangelicals to give them something to hold on to. The rest of the stuff became, if it was icing on the cake. But he was not going to run a typical, evangelical-based, I got to make sure that I touch that group, I got to make sure that I touch that group. He gave a bigger message. Here's a guy who spent the entire campaign personifying what was wrong with Washington and touching on the anger, and yet that overriding message was able to bring together a coalition large enough to win the presidency.
But in any other presidential contest, someone with some of those views or subscribed to certain thinking would not have been able not have been able to supersede what was confronting them. It was the environment and the anger among the electorate where they felt they had been pushed into a corner and they wanted to be heard at all costs, which allowed for it, I believe.
But Donald Trump also, we did not run a campaign of we're going to have a coalition that's going to only talk to 36-year-old African-American men who live in this community. We didn't do that. It was the same message, whether we were in Massachusetts or we were in California, if we were in Minnesota or Florida. It was the same message. We didn't have a traditional campaign of coalitions. We didn't have a women's coalition, a small business coalition, this coalition. I didn't care about any of that stuff. It's the same message for everybody. The same message, which is so simplistic. What are you going to do? I'm going to make America great again. Think of that branding. I don't know who else's campaign could do that. Donald Trump said, I'm going to make America great again. And, with all due respect to Jeb, he had 3 or 4 different launches, Jeb 2.0, Jeb 2.5, Jeb 3.0, whatever it was. We just stuck on the same message the entire time. It was so simplistic, and it didn't target any specific demographic. It targeted every demographic. So we didn't have this notion where we have to go win evangelicals in South Carolina in order to be successful. We have to go win Latinos in Florida in order to be successful. We had the same message for everybody. We also had some good surrogates like Jerry Falwell Jr., who would come out and say, look, Donald Trump isn't a perfect man, okay? We're not voting for the Sunday school teacher. We're voting for President of the United States. And those types of people, particularly as the campaign went on, gave a lot of credibility if there was any potential hesitation of supporting Donald Trump. Just look at the percentage of vote he got in the black community, right? He beat Mitt Romney by 2 points from 4 years ago. He beat John McCain by 100% from what John McCain got 8 years ago in the African-American community alone. And all we heard for the longest time was Donald Trump is a racist and he'll only get 1% of the black community.
One other point I'd like to stress on that, and we did it very openly. Donald Trump in June and July was meeting with all of the evangelical leaders in big events and was communicating to them, but the leadership was getting a sense that they trusted this man, and even though they didn't agree, as Corey and Donald and Tony said, with everything, his head was in the right place. The religious freedom messaging that we gave, and how we were going to repeal the part of the tax code which punishes the churches from being able to participate. That had a strong resonance inside of the community, so that maybe we disagreed on some of the important issues, but we were there to protect them. And we were going to do the things that were necessary, that were going to make them happy as president, including, and it cannot be underestimated, the Supreme Court justices thing, which everybody read in their own way to be, he's committed to our values. And so after July, when we had met with all the leadership in a number of different conferences, they went back to their parishes and the churches and everything else, and they were on board. And they were passing the messages along. And it got into the grassroots. So, and we did that all in public. I mean, there was nothing secret going on. But you all never appreciated it because you looked at his personal life and you said he'll never have the appeal to motivate these people. And they were part of the hard base.
Well, Chip Saltsman with the Huckabee campaign, and talking about, I think we can say we competed for the evangelical vote, or at least tried. And what Paul was saying about the New York event and all the events, in the evangelical community that I was talking to, the overriding factor was his children and how he was as a dad. And when you get to the evangelical voters, they were as mad as everybody else. I can't cuss because Huckabee will get mad at me if I do that. But they were still mad. But the overreaching was when they brought the kids out and they said he was a great dad. They raised him. And that's what I heard over and over again in the evangelical communities.
I think it's Jason Johnson Cruz campaign. I think it's important to distinguish between the primary and the general, and this panel is supposed to be on the primary. I agree completely with the comments that were made about how those evangelical voters who were holding out came home in the end. It was a binary choice, and they made the right choice. But with regard to the primary, I think it's important to go back, and if you look at evangelicals, or frankly any denomination, any faith, etc., the most important determining factor, if you'll look back in the rearview mirror, was frequency of church attendance. And with all respect, and I'm sure Terry could speak to this, there's always this great focus on the state of South Carolina as the barometer, litmus test, whatever you want to say, for evangelicals. That's just frankly not so. It is Iowa. And in the state of Iowa, which we skipped over, that is where the evangelicals had the most influence, and their choice at second and third was Donald Trump. But if you look throughout the entire primary process, the more frequent a person's attendance in their place of worship, that was very predictive of how they voted. And the more frequently they attended, the less support there was for Donald Trump in the primary.
Paul, can we talk about the moment that you were hired on the Trump campaign? What was your understanding of why you were being brought in, what your job description was, and what was the state of the campaign internally?
It was a transition point in the process. Trump was winning everywhere, and yet the delegates weren't necessarily following because of the bifurcated system of primaries and delegate selection. In some states, the delegates had to follow the results of the primaries, but it didn't mean that the delegates selected were necessarily going to be Trump people. Other places, there was actually some flexibility on the part of the delegates, and one of the things that Corey and Mr. Trump discovered was that the Cruz campaign was running an organizational campaign, and their strategy was not just looking at winning the primaries, but they had a secondary strategy of focusing on the convention and working backwards, a more traditional organizational Republican nominating process strategy. And I was brought on to figure out how to secure the delegates that he had won already, and how to keep this from happening in the future. And and as we did the audit of where things were, we came to a couple of important conclusions. One was that on a number of the states that had primaries and a number of the states where there were going to be caucuses, the delegate selection process for the state conventions was pretty far down the road. So that if you hadn't participated at the local level, precinct level, or the district level, the cards were pretty much already dealt, and the delegates were already ordained for one candidate or another. And Mr. Trump's approach had been to keep winning, which was a smart strategy, but it got to a point now where what I said we needed to start winning in a more focused way. We need to start winning delegates as delegates. And because of the successes they had in the primaries, he was in the strongest position to win if he began to expand the campaign to the more traditional delegate operation strategy. But the audit we did showed that if we only focused on, this was about the end of March, right before Wisconsin, if we only focused on the delegates that have been selected so far, or the primaries that have been selected so far, we'd be spending a lot of time and we weren't going to be very successful because the state convention delegates were already chosen. And so that meant we were going to have at least a month of bad Saturdays. But that what we needed to do was to focus on the upcoming primaries, because after Wisconsin, it was a good set of primaries if we had the right strategy. You had, and it looked really perfect. Wisconsin was on the 5th, and then you had the New York primary sitting out there on the 19th, which gave us 2 weeks to put a strategy together for New York. And then you had the Northeastern primaries, of which Pennsylvania was very complicated, but was real opportunistic. And then you had sitting out there at the beginning of May, Indiana, which everybody thought was going to be Trump's Achilles heel. But we felt, based on some of the work we were doing in the social media space, and as well as some of the progress we were having with the evangelicals, that the right strategy could work. So we put together a plan that built on itself. And the key to it was running congressional campaign strategies, not to run statewide strategies. In New York, nobody thought we'd get more than 60 delegate votes, and we targeted 89 is what we were looking for. And we got 91. And that was going to be very important to us. So people saw Trump campaigning in certain black districts that had very few Republican voters, and they started to wonder. And then the only other person they'd see there, of course, was Cruz, who also understood the strategy of why lesser number of delegates, people voting in one of the congressional districts, could sneak you a couple of delegates. The problem was the only other guy that was doing that was the guy that we had the New York values thing on, that we were hitting him hard with. And so our goal was not to fix what had already happened, because it was too late, to make sure that states coming up where we were choosing delegates at the precinct level we did play in, which we started to do. And so I told Mr. Trump, if we pull this strategy off, we're going to have, for the next month, a lot of good Tuesdays and a lot of bad Saturdays. But the bad Saturdays aren't going to affect your delegate count, because they're bodies that are getting elected, not delegates. We've already won the delegates, but the upcoming Tuesdays are going to give us delegates and wins. And the goal here is to not have a second ballot, because the whole Cruz strategy is predicated on not having you at the magic number on the first ballot. If we win the next 4 weeks, we will only have one ballot. And nobody believed that. But we could see the path was pretty clear and pretty obvious. And the key, there were three keys: New York, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. Indiana, nobody saw us coming until it was too late. I mean, Brad was working, quietly in the social media space there. We put in a Don Jr. ad that talked about his father, and that was playing out there before anybody was paying attention. They were still looking in the Northeast. And so we saw our numbers go from 7 or 8 down to 7 or 8 up before people were even focusing on Indiana. So we felt pretty good about that way before Indiana, and we knew that it would get even bigger based on a strong Northeast primary process.
So we're getting near the end. We have to have time for a couple of student questions, but I wanted to ask about two things that happened in the end game in the primary season, sort of a Hail Mary passes from the Cruz camp, frankly. One was the attempt to work out an arrangement with Governor Kasich, and the second one was the Ted Carly combination. Can you guys talk a little bit about how those two things happened and why they didn't work out better?
Yeah, well, we were talking about errors we made. I think doing a deal with Kasich. First of all, we didn't want to pick Indiana to be our dying ground. That was not a great place for us. The suburbs, we had acquired a lot of Rubio territory, which is we were able to seep into the suburbs a lot better than we had earlier in the campaign. But we were starting to lose the rural areas to Trump, and so Indiana was not a great place for us. We'd rather gone to Nebraska, which is the week after. We just could not hang on because of the, we'd actually did a deal with Kasich in New York. We just didn't ever announce it or confirm it. We left the state early to get out of his way to hopefully let him get 12 to 15 delegates. And we were not in the state of New York for the last 72 hours except for a Jimmy Fallon interview. So, and they spent $3.5 million, and the last we could tell they only had 2 on hand. So we could tell Kasich was going broke on New York. And so instead of fighting him for that, we decided to kind of get out of the way. Pennsylvania, we thought we put some money into Pennsylvania. I'd probably do that again. I probably wouldn't do that again. But anyway, the deal that we did was because presence in a market, in a DMA, gives you 2.5 to 5 points for every event that you do. And so we couldn't even have him in the state. We needed every single vote. And so looking back, it kind of played into the rigged elections and, we became more of the establishment choice in Indiana, which allowed us to be targeted as the ones as an insider more than Kasich was, which we had kind of pushed for most of the time. So that was a mistake. I wouldn't do it again. I don't know what other options we had to get him out. And then we swapped a couple states that, if the deal went south, we'd still be okay and still probably be able to win New Mexico because it's adjacent to Texas anyway. Not that we would have reneged, but, it's politics. So, but it was bad for Indiana. On Carly, we started the vetting process early on VP. We had there's only a few times that you get to make news. We'd lost, I don't know what it was. We hadn't got over 25% media share forever except for the Carly pick. I'll let JJ speak to the Carly pick because kind of tag team this, but that was not a mistake, and she's a stud.
Right. People characterized it as a Hail Mary, and that's fair. Jeff just referenced share of media. We've talked about that from different angles all along. We knew we had to do something at that point. It was do or die to cut through the near 100% share, by the way, that was all Donald Trump all the time. And something changed that was very significant the week before New York. And that was, it wasn't only the number of mentions of Donald Trump in the media. The increase in the positive mentions shot through the roof, and a specific message. We reached a tipping point. And that message was, it really doesn't matter what happens. He is the only one who can win the nomination. And that was devastating. That was fatal. You remind me, I think it was in,
91.
What's that?
91%.
Yeah, in Wisconsin. Indiana, 91% of those who were voting for Ted Cruz said, yeah, but Donald Trump's going to be the guy. So we had to do something, no doubt. But to cut to the chase on Carly, as Jeff said, the vetting had gone on for a long time. And from my perspective, and I was in the vehicle with him when he made the call to her, the last thing I said to him, I said, here's the beauty of this. People are going to analyze it. What is the politics of it? I said, here's the way I think that you should make the decision, and I think you have. And I think we were all on the same page. If you were about to make this call right before the Republican convention, when you were about to accept the nomination, who would you call? And he said, I'd call Carly. And so it was simple. Obviously, it didn't work to win, but it was a good choice, and it was the choice that he had already made should he become the nominee.
Can I just ask real quick, going to the Kasich thing, were there discussions earlier in the process or between any of the other campaigns about potential collusion or teaming up?
I'll say one thing about the Kasich thing, because I think a lot of candidates have to decide this. If you've never been in the room when it is time to drop out of a campaign, you just don't know what that's like unless you've had that conversation with a candidate. And I think given the anger toward Donald Trump, there was so much pressure on people to stay in too long. And I can tell you, after the debate flare up with Senator Rubio, we had so many people come to us after New Hampshire in the next 48 hours or so before we made it to beg us to stay in, to give us money, but who were not going to endorse us or actually do anything to help us. And I think the most frustrating part for probably everybody around the table was most people in the Republican Party establishment, whatever it is, governors, senators, donors, congressmen, never got behind anybody when it mattered. They all stayed on their hands. They sat on their hands until after South Carolina or right before South Carolina. At that point, it was over. It was over. We can go through all these different things. Nobody who's ever won 2 out of the first 3 in either party has ever lost, especially we win 2 out of the first 3 by 10 points in a crowded and pretty good field. So the fact that Mitt Romney never endorsed anybody when he potentially could have been very influential in terms of his endorsement and the money he could have brought people was, I think, a huge factor. And so, for Governor Christie, and I'm sure for others around the table, you have to make the decision about, not having a vanity exercise and not, hurting somebody just for the sake of hurting somebody. But the thing that was really telling to me was most people sat on the sidelines until it was way too late. And the fact that people wanted to use other candidates as a vehicle to hurt somebody without actually helping somebody was incredibly telling. And there was probably much more of that went on in every campaign or every donor discussion or discussion with some governor to endorse than probably is known or will ever be discussed.
We got to get to the student questions now before we run out of time. First question is from Tyler.
I don't think there was no formal relationship with Breitbart or the Trump campaign. I think they are a outlet that saw the appeal of Donald Trump early, and also, like many other outlets, benefited from covering Donald Trump. And I think that's the case with every major media outlet, not just Breitbart News, but also the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and everybody else who was looking to get clicks on their website. I think the difference was that the market that Breitbart services is not the mainstream media. It's a group of people who are traditionally going to be voting in Republican primaries, and their role was to provide information to those readers based on what Donald Trump is doing.
Anybody else want to weigh in on Breitbart? Other campaigns?
How long do we have?
Soraya?
It's actually
Oh, there.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm a freshman.
As far as running the convention and our concerns, we were not worried about any third party, revolt at the convention. The Trump effort was really a media effort. They didn't have any strength among delegates of significance. It was never a factor. And our whole goal at the convention was focused on Donald Trump, not focused on all of the other activity that was going on in the media. And our goal was really to to really accomplish 4 things. One was to unite the party. 2 was to establish the theme that this was a change election, and that we were the change candidate. 3 was to give a sense of who Donald Trump was, and that's why the heavy emphasis on his family, his friends, his business associates, in prominent speaking places in the program. And 4th, and most important, was the speech itself, of his vision. A speech that was criticized roundly, but frankly was very effective for what we were trying to accomplish, because it spoke to the American people about what they felt, and the voters that we thought were disaffected, it resonated with them. So that is what the whole convention was about, those 4 things. We never let a fear of a third-party candidacy or a dump Trump movement get in the way of our thinking.
If I could add one thing, I think this whole election cycle broke just about every rule that we ever thought there was in politics. But I think one rule remains the same. You can't beat somebody with nobody. And there never was a consensus never Trump candidate. It was talked about, it was debated, but that person never appeared. And so the whole thing was to me a joke all along, unless you had one person who was going to stand up and say, I'm the face, I'm the candidate, I'm the never Trump person. Even then, I think it would have failed, but without that person, there was a never Trump. The never Trump movement was never really real without a candidate to be behind.
Jason or Jeff, can you just bring us back to the convention, the decision to say vote your conscience? What were the deliberations that were going on?
I feel a grenade. He's bigger. You want to jump on it? I mean, look, many discussions, long discussions, but I would boil it down to this. I agree completely that with regard to there was no candidate, so nothing was ever going to happen. I disagree, however, and I think this is important, going back to the comments made in the beginning, this is, a first look at history. Never Trump was real in certain regards. It was very real. And while we've all talked here, and there's been lots of discussion in public since the end of the campaign about what was really going on, and Corey's addressed it really well, and so has Tony, and how it worked, and it was brilliant, there were a significant percentage of Republicans who still are not post-ideological, for example, and certainly are not post-constitutional, who thought it was important that certain points be made go forward. So from that perspective, it was very real. And with regard to the choice of vote your conscience, I know how I remember it. In the conference room beforehand, when we looked at the draft, that came straight from him. And it was sincere. Was it naive politically? Maybe so. But he actually spoke his conscience in that speech. And like many other things that have been mentioned throughout the process, I think it started from Chip with Rand, he was not rewarded for doing so. So,
last question.
Oh, I want to add something just on that for Ted's sake. Sorry. That, so when you drop out of a campaign, you go dark. And even Ted Cruz goes dark. And I actually don't think that he understood the loaded word that was. He said before he went out, and he said afterwards, and of course if you're a candidate that's gotten millions of votes and won hundreds of delegates and blah, 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 then you think that you're speaking for them to a certain degree. And he was trying to provide a path for the party provide a path for Trump to unify the party behind a set of core principles. It was not to blow the convention up. That was a surprise to him. We understood that he could get booed. But just to add the historical context of it, the eventual outcome of what he was trying to accomplish, he thought that he could pull it off, and he didn't get it done. It was not intended to be the blow up the ship like it came across. And in fact, it was a 13-minute and 48-second speech, which because of applause, and he definitely soaked up all the applause, he didn't get to the punchline until 22 minutes and 58 seconds in, and everybody's pissed off at a 23-minute speech unless you're the nominee. And so if the, another course or another delivery strategy or something like that, but that is just for the moments of history, it was not and I don't believe he had kind of gone dark during that whole delegate fight about vote your conscience. We purposely pulled out of any organizational strategy to stop Trump on the first ballot, to do the dump Trump thing. There were some activists on our behalf, on their own behalf. There were also supporters of us that did some things, but nothing with the advocacy of our campaign. So I thought it was good to add to the point that Ted's point was to show if you're going to unify the party, get constitutional conservatives like himself and like he believes the millions of people that support him advocate for, this is the path to do it, and it's a shared set of values and principles that Trump needs to bring along.
Which is last thing, if you don't watch the speech and just read the transcript of the speech, it's exactly what it said.
Well, I like to call my favorite part of the campaign the golden days. It was like October to November 15th, 2015.
November 13th.
13th, yeah, November 13th to be exact. Where we led the polls. We were the only person to consistently, we were ahead in Texas during that period. And we couldn't really believe it, to tell you the truth. The first 6 weeks of the fourth quarter, we raised $22 million, which, we raised $63 million in 2015. We were going gangbusters. And then we ran into Paris, Armstrong Williams, a couple other issues that just, in the next 6 weeks of the fourth quarter, we raised $1.5 million. I mean, there was a switch. That was totally self-inflicted. Not totally, but it was self-inflicted. So, I think that there was an opportunity for a nice outsider to win until Paris came, and then all of a sudden we needed strength again. We were kind of getting over a little bit of strength, and Ben's probably a pretty inspirational guy. He's the 8th black brain surgeon to ever walk the face of the earth. He saved more lives than certainly anybody in this room. He grew up in a car, lived in public housing. He's got a lot to offer, but homework wasn't always number one priority. But yes, there was a chance, and we were doing really, really well. We had a warehouse full of stuff because we sold 80,000 hats in 2015. 15,000 lithographs. It was amazing. When we started the campaign, I needed a campaign bus. I didn't have any money, so I let people put their kids' names on the side of the bus for $20. We raised $280,000 to buy the bus. There was a path.
And what about from the more establishment candidates?
I think it would have had to been real early. At a certain point, probably August, Trump was, Godzilla walking into the power plant. Everybody thought he'd blow up, and he just got stronger every time. He touched the third rail, he touched the fourth rail, he touched the fifth rail. He kept growing, he kept getting bigger. The feedback loop that has been talked about was kind of unstoppable by then. But I think you'd have had to define him out of the race real early. And, Jeb, I think the chaos candidate thing was probably a late shot that didn't do it, but I think if you could have hung that sort of big concept around him in July, maybe it would have been different.
I want to thank everyone for participating. Thank our moderators. We're gonna We're going to move Nick Bilton and David Farrenhold till after lunch. So we're going to break now for an hour for lunch, and we'll see you back in here in an hour for a short panel on media and then the general election. Thank you.